10 to 7 here on the programme. So, as former President Jacob Zuma made his court appearance last Friday, Prosecutor Billy Downer told the Durban High Court that the state was ready to prosecute. However, there are still a few issues to be dealt with, including the former president's application for a review of the decision to charge him. Joining us to talk a little bit more about this is Henie Van Vuuren. He's written extensively on the arms deal, and he's in our parliamentary studios helping us with a little bit of understanding. Thanks again, Henie. It's great having you here. Henie, you know, one of the things that former President Jacob Zuma did say on Friday was that he was working in KwaZulu-Natal as the economic development MEC at the time, and he was. I mean, that was his position when the arms deal and the arms were brought. In your records and recollection, how does he get implicated in his personal capacity in this case?
Yeah, and I think that Mr. Zuma's period, President Zuma's period in KwaZulu-Natal is important because it's perhaps precisely the way some of these deals are formulated. Sometimes we have an idea that there's the head of state or president. It certainly happens in some countries where the arms company pays some money across the table and they get a contract in return. And the situation with Mr. Zuma was perhaps more symptomatic of many things work. You have arms companies that use middlemen to nurture relationships with politicians. And that's what happened in the case of former President Zuma. We know that in 2005, his former financial advisor, Mr. Shabir Sheikh, was found guilty on charges of corruption. This went all the way through all our courts, and he was sentenced to a prison term, which he finally didn't serve out. But Mr. Sheikh in the mid-1990s was Mr. Zuma's financial advisor, and working at that time with a company very closely linked to Thales, to what was then known as Thomson CSF Thales, the French arms company, and in fact became the conduit for the relationship between Mr. Zuma and Thales. It became in the form of payments that were made initially to Mr. Zuma, and it was the argument that there was an untoward or a corrupt relationship that existed between them, and this relationship morphed beyond just the involvement of Mr. Sheikh in the 1980s. What we've seen in the 2000s is a relationship that developed involving a man by the name of A.J. Suklal, former official of the Department of Trade and Industry, who has recently emerged with evidence that he was in fact employed by Thales to act as a sort of a fixer. He's a lawyer by profession, but he was asked to work closely with Mr. Zuma, particularly during the period when he was ejected out of office as deputy president of the country in 2005, 2006, and he witnessed the continuous payment of bribes, he argues. Even the famous code word where Mr. Zuma has said when he had received the money from Thales, the lights are shining tonight on the Eiffel Tower. And so we have these middlemen, these men who've played different roles over almost a decade and a little longer in the life of Mr. Zuma, but so directly linked to the arms company Thales and implicated in bribing Mr. Zuma. And so we see a relationship that develops over time as opposed to one where there's one-off payment, you know, again, under a table, and something that's much more complex than that.
Yeah, very interesting. You know, we've also got the DA who have, you know, constantly been at this case. I mean, they would not let this go away, and that's an underestimation when we speak about what they've been doing to make sure that this gets its day in court. But the DA basically believing that Parliament was systematically and purposefully undermined to ensure that government would be exonerated by any probe into the arms deal. I mean, do you think that this is the case? Do you think they can get anywhere with this case when evidence may very well have been destroyed, disappeared, and because, as you're saying, there's so many people implicated?
No, Leanne, I think it's such an important question because what happens is we tend to think of past crimes as things that we cannot hold to account. The organisation where I work, Open Secrets, and many other civil society organisations have argued that the perpetrators of crimes during apartheid who are involved in economic crimes can be held to account because there is evidence. And certainly the same applies to the arms deal. I think it's important to remember that the Democratic Alliance is one of the organisations that within amongst our political parties that have pushed really hard for accountability on this issue issue, and I think rightly so. But there have also been voices who've been sidelined within the ANC who have tried to do the same thing, and certainly leaders in civil society who've argued for a very long time that this should happen. Crucially, though, we do know that the National Prosecuting Authority has much of this evidence. The evidence of corruption sits in containers outside its headquarters in Silverton of corruption in a whole range of other arms deals, we believe. There's evidence that was produced, as I mentioned earlier, by the arms companies themselves, by their own investigations that show corruption. And then, importantly, in this specific case, we have the role of Mr. Shabir Shaik, his former financial advisor we spoke of, who was prosecuted, and that generated not only witnesses who appeared in court, a court record, but also documentary evidence. In fact, it's this evidence that the prosecuting authority was hoping to use in their proposed prosecution of Mr. Zuma since as early as 2008. So we do know that the state has indicated that they can call as many as 200 witnesses. Let's assume they may call as many as 100 of those. Many of them are some of the key people who had information of corruption during the trial of Mr. Shabir Shaik during the mid-2000s. And you know, I would imagine that it's the weight of that potential evidence that has driven the absolute fear into Mr. Zuma's legal team on the one hand, and importantly, the legal team of the firm Thales, because there's no other reason that they would go to their heads of state, to former President Sarkozy, to get him to lean on the South African government to block this and stop this investigation into their own company alleged to be involved in corruption. And I think that all those implicated, not only Mr. Zuma and Thales, but many others, are no doubt very worried about the outcome of this process and what it could mean for there finally being accountability for an arms deal which has been through cover-up after cover-up after cover-up.
Sure. Henie, thank you so very much for talking to us here on Morning Live. I think we really appreciate your views on all of this. Henie Van Vuuren is an author and director of Open Secrets, commenting on the arms deal case as former President Zuma made his first court appearance on Friday on charges related to the arms deal. Let's take a break here on the program. When we return, we'll have